Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Comp 1 students. So we are going to delve into our first essay that we're going to write in this class, which is going to be a descriptive narrative essay. It is actually going to be a eulogy. We will talk about that in a different video, but the descriptive and narrative writing are going to be the foundations that you use to build that essay. So I specifically want to talk about descriptive and narrative writing with you today and get a better understanding of it so you have a better understanding when you go into writing this essay. So one of the things that we were going to ask ourselves is why would we use and why do we use narration and description in composition writing, specifically academically? Because you guys are moving into academic courses. Some of you are going to go on to four-year colleges where you're going into degree programs that you think, I don't need to tell a story. But maybe you do, because storytelling can actually be a really good way to interest your readers in what you're writing. Descriptive writing specifically is going to engage your readers in the essay that you're writing or whatever you're writing. If you have descriptions and details, your readers are more interested in what you're talking about. It's most often found in creative writing, of course. Same thing with narration. Storytelling is most often found in creative writing, but it can be used in academic writing to help enhance the essay. Keep in mind that even though we are writing an essay that uses narration and description, that doesn't stop here. These are skills that you can move on and use in other essays. Descriptive writing is also going to help you understand and learn how to use figurative language like similes and analogies and metaphors, things that you can use to showcase points in your writing. It will also help you learn how to spot things like fallacies in writing, which is going to be very important when you start arguing. Okay? Narration itself, the storytelling aspect, is actually a great tool to have because telling a story can be vital in getting your reader interested in reading the essay. But also, you may need to be able to narrate something in your writing, and knowing how to do that and how to do so effectively will make you a better writer. So, the first thing I do want to talk about is narration and narrative writing. What is narration? Narration itself is using a sequence of events to make a point, or it's just telling a story. Storytelling is something that we all do at some point in our lives, whether we're little kids or we do it as teenagers or as adults. Some people make livings off of writing stories, but you can still use them in your academic writing to better enhance your writing itself. You want your readers to learn what the experience is, and so telling a story can help them learn that experience that way, being able to be immersed in the experience. Narration is also going to make a point when you're using it. It's not just there to be pretty. You have a point behind the narrative story you're telling. I mentioned previously in the lecture that implied theses make a point, but they're not outright points. The same thing with narration. They're going to make a point. Now, how can you do this in academic and composition writing? You can do it through presenting a sequence of events to your readers. Sequence of events is how an event occurs, and there are three ways that you can do sequence of events. The first is chronological order, and that's the order in which things occur, beginning to end. It's how we most often describe things. If you were talking about the birth of your child, you would talk about the day they were born, their milestones, each milestone, the moment they happen, and then up to whatever point you're going to, A to Z. You can also do it through flashbacks, which is something that a lot of writers will use in fiction writing, or even movies use it, where you look back at a point in the past to discuss something in the present as well. Sometimes you want to emphasize the importance of something in the narrative, and you'll use flashback to do that. You are going to use a mixture of flashback and chronological order in writing your essay that we're going to wind up writing. Then you have foreshadowing. Foreshadowing just gives a hint at things that are going to happen. So you are using this to tease about what's to come. Maybe I'm going to talk about this. Let me just drop it in there. For your essay, though, you are going to use a flashback, which will engage in chronological discussion of that flashback. So keep that in mind. You're going to make a point through this. You want your readers to learn about something through that event. So you're going to describe the event in narrative form so they can learn about it. Sometimes you may use narration to present new information to people to make a point. If you're in a lab setting, like a biology lab or a chemistry lab, you may be asked to write down the steps which you took that wound up with the process that you got. So in chemistry, sometimes you have experiments that you do and something may go wrong, or you may have a different outcome. So you're going to be asked to narrate what you did, A to Z, and you need to be able to do so and do so well so you can recreate that process or somebody else could recreate that process. So keep in mind, narration is used in many aspects of life. Same thing happens if you're going into the nursing field. A lot of times you're going to be asked to narrate your experience with your client. You're going to have to give those details beginning to end. That's what narration does. You can do that through action and detail. Detail is where we're going to talk about the description part, but action is things that happen. What is going on? They are these things that are going to draw your reader in, but they're also going to paint a picture. To be able to do this, you can use physical descriptions or action verbs, runs, kicks, jumps. You can also use dialogue to convey action and detail. And some of you are thinking, dialogue, Miss Cravens. Why would we use dialogue? Well, that's the fun thing about this. Dialogue is actually very helpful when you're looking at writing, because being able to hear the words is helpful to your reader sometimes. Hearing people speak is an experience, and some of you may have read books where you can hear the character speaking and you have a different experience with that. Dialogue helps you do that. When you're writing this specific essay you're going to write, if there is dialogue present, please do not hesitate to use slang or colloquial terms or other things that the person uses. Don't try to sanitize the writing and the voice of other people. You're also going to have your own narrative voice when you write. And that is something that I always impress upon students. I can always tell when it's a student writing and when it's somebody else, because you all have your own voice, your own dialogue that you use, the way you write, the nuances. And it's so easy to pick up on, but you don't want to sanitize that down to the point that you lose yourself in your writing. So keep those little things in mind. You are also going to tell stories from a particular point of view. Now, most of you are familiar with point of view in the fact that first person or third person is the point of view you know. First person gives you that personal tone. I am talking about myself. I know what I did. I know how I feel. I can tell that story. Nobody else can. Third person is where you're looking from the outside in and you're able to say, I can see what they're doing, but it's much more objective. With the essay you're going to write, you are going to mix points of view, and it's going to be a little weird. So you're going to be telling a first person story, but it's going to be about yourself. So you'll be referring to yourself in third person. So if this was me writing mine, it would be, I have known Sabrina since she was 5. She was a great person. I usually don't refer to myself in third person, but in this essay, you're going to have to. So keep that in mind. It is going to be weird, but I promise you, you will get the hang of it. Now, how are you going to narrate? How are you going to integrate narration into the essay itself? There are 4 easy ways to do this. You can use a story, which is telling a story to make the point that you want to make. Many of you, and I spoke about this when we spoke about essays and thesis statements, many of you were taught to use a hook to get your readers interested in the actual essay you're writing. Stories are ways to do that. Keep your narrative short. Don't prolong and give me far too unnecessary details. And we are all guilty of this sometimes, where if we're telling a story, we may start telling it and then we pick up on a detail that has no importance to the story, but we start talking about that. And that lengthens the story and causes problems. Your reader's like, gosh, can you please stop? And then you're like, sorry about that, bro. Keep it short. Get to the point of your story, but make sure you're telling a strong story by doing that. You are going to introduce your story with a transitional sentence or clause. You're always going to use transitions in your writings. This is especially important in storytelling. Keep that in mind. Use your transitions, guys. Start working on noticing how you transition between paragraphs and actual content. The last thing you're going to do is use descriptive language, dialogue, and action because those are ways to integrate narration into your writing. Easy, easy ways. Now, I said we're going to integrate descriptive language and dialogue. So let's look at description. I know some of you are like, I don't like descriptive writing, and I understand it. I do. I get it, guys. Descriptive writing can be difficult, especially if you are not used to it. So, how can descriptive writing be used in composition and academic writing? And some of you are probably thinking, you don't use descriptive writing in composition and academic writing, Miss Cravens, but you do. So let's knock that idea out that you don't. There are 5 ways that you're going to do this. The 5 are using sensory details, creating dominant impressions for your reader, using connotative language, offering comparisons, and having a specific organizational method. Now, these are things that in concept seem difficult, but let's talk about each of them and break them down and give you a better understanding so you know how to do this. So, what about the 5 senses? We all know we have 5 senses. That is your sensory details. That's how the 5 senses work. Sensory details. So you have 5: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. You all have them, hopefully. If you don't, you may be missing 1 or 2, but most people have these details, or they may be able to have an approximation of that detail. So your sensory details are going to pull your reader in and build this visual for them. And visuals can happen in a lot of ways. I have certain smells that I associate with people, like my grandmother's. Those smells are very tied into my memory. So if I get hit with those scents, I'm like, wow, that's my grandma. Also, things like patterns. One of my grandmothers was really fond of floral patterns. So every time I see something clothing wise that's floral, I'm like, that would be my grandma. That is totally my grandma. But what I want you to do is think about the county fair, because this is something that most people have an experience with and they can discuss. So you're at the county fair, you're at your local fair. Think about what the fair looks like. What is your local fair like? When you go there, what do you see? For me, visually, I see lights, very bright lights, flashing lights. A lot of them are like yellows and blues and reds. You're going to see rides of some kind, little children's rides that just go up and down very slowly. You're going to see kids' rides, and I say kids and I mean teenagers generally, preteens, teens, that are a little bit faster, a little bit more scary, and that's a very vague term. You're also going to see like the food booths that are there. For me, I also see animals because my local fair tends to have cows and pigs and things like that. So those are the sights of the fair. And then you have the sounds. Sounds are also indicative of things. You can talk about the screams of people, and they're not screams of terror. They might be vague terror, but they're actually just like screams of happy terror, joy. Kids enjoying themselves, shouting, laughter. Depending on the fair, you may have music that's going on, like people performing. One of my local fairs used to do pageants, so you would hear pageantry things happening. You've also got the sounds of the animals and livestock, if they are there, and the sounds of the machinery, which tend to be very loud and mechanical. And that's something that you can hear when you think about it. And then the one that everybody has, the smell. And smell tends to be tied into taste as well, but let's talk about the smell. For me, the fair always happened in August, so it was always a hot time. So there's that little bit of smell of like sweat that is associated with it because, you know, we sweat in the summer here. There's like the sweaty bodies. You've got the smell maybe of sunscreen if it's the daytime because you put sunscreen on to protect your kids while they're out playing so they don't get burnt. You also have the smell of the food, cotton candy, that sickly, sweet sugary smell. You've got the smell of fried foods, corn dogs, the overwhelming smell of ketchup and mustard, the tang of those, because those are in abundance there. You also have the smell maybe of exhaust because they are running machines and there's going to be exhaust somewhere. So you've got that like gasoline smell, but there's also the smell of the farm animals, that like heaty, musky scent of livestock that happens. Then you've got the taste. What does a corn dog taste like? What does a fried Snickers taste like? Because a lot of our fairs have fried foods and they're very common. What does a fried Oreo taste like? What about cotton candy? What does cotton candy taste like for you, for somebody who might have never experienced it? And then there's touch, which isn't specifically always like touching things, but like the feel of stuff. For myself, the fair was always, as I said, during the summer. So my fair was always a very like sticky time because you're sweating. And like when you sweat, you all know your clothes tend to stick to you. There's also like the kind of the heat of the metal seats of whatever you're on, and the feel of like the vaguely frayed buckles that buckle you in. Sometimes you've got the touch of like the little metal tip of the dart when you're playing a game, or maybe there's a bit of water from pickup ducks that you've got on you. But keep the five senses in mind because they're a great way to pull your reader in and paint a picture for them. And using senses, whether it's the sight or the sound, smell, taste, or touch, actually can evoke a lot of things for your readers and give them a better experience in reading. Along with the senses, as I mentioned, you're going to create a dominant impression. So what is a dominant impression? Well, that is your overall attitude, mood, or feeling about the subject. When I talk about the fair, for me, it's very nostalgic. I feel like things have changed significantly since I was a teenager, and a lot of people don't go to the fair anymore. They don't care for it or whatever. But the fair for me was always this like nostalgia boost because it always happened the first week that we started back to school. And it was always an expectation. We were going to go to the fair. We were going to do things. It was going to be fun. I was going to get an armband and ride until I was sick. I was going to enjoy myself. I was going to see friends there. That is my dominant impression. But if you want me to talk about the summer, my overall feeling about summer is I hate it. It's awful. When I describe summer to people in the South, I use words that are very negative. And you know, I don't like it when I use those. For the essay you're going to be writing, the eulogy, the dominant impression that you want to create is something that shows you in a positive light and talks about you in reverence. You are metaphorically deceased. Not really, but metaphorically. So you're talking about yourself as if you are deceased and how great of a person you are. And yes, you are all great people. And I know some of you are like, no, I'm not. There's something good about you. And you're going to explore that in this essay. The third thing we talked about was connotative language. So what is connotative language? This is one of my favorite ones to talk about with my students because my students always have differing opinions on this. Connotative language has two different things that apply to it. You want to use connotative language effectively because connotative language can have many different meanings and it can make people feel different ways. So there is denotation with connotative language and connotation. Denotation is the precise dictionary meaning of the word. So if I go to my phone or to a dictionary and I look up a word, that is the denotation of that word. The word literally means XYZ. Connotation is different though. Connotation are the feelings and attitudes about a word, and connotations about a word can change over time. Words can become problematic, become reclaimed by a group, and then become better, or vice versa. So when you think about connotations, it's the feeling that you get when that word is used. And I like to use the phrase of like redneck, hick, and hillbilly because those are words that everybody has different meanings for them. And you look at those, and some people will think that a redneck is, they're okay. Some people may classify rednecks as problematic, or they have a different definition. They may feel like rednecks are just, those like weird people that you see out in the woods. For some people, hick is a word that just doesn't exist in their vocabulary and they don't know what that is. For others, it's like, have you ever watched I think it's the Wild and Wonderful Whites of West Virginia? Those are hicks. But to other people, those are hillbillies. And I like to joke that on my mother's side of the family, we have a lot of rednecks. We have a lot of very like country people, because to me redneck tends to mean country. A lot of rednecks in her family, wearing the overalls, doing their thing. Not a lot of hicks in my mom's family, and there are no hillbillies. But on my father's side, he very specifically has members of his family that are hillbillies. And of course, there's the show The Beverly Hillbillies that most of you may be familiar with. That may be a reference that goes over some heads. That's okay. But for my father's side of the family, the hillbillies aren't the country like the redneck people. They are country people, which means that these are my family members who at one point in my life did not have running water in their home. Getting a refrigerator was a big deal for them. When they were younger, and when I was younger, they used to raise and slaughter their own cattle and pigs. They did not go to the store. They gardened. They were very self-contained, and they lived in the hills. But these are words that have connotations, meanings to them that are either good or bad. And you have to remember when you're writing that connotative language is going to be something you have to keep in the forefront of your mind. Because even if you use a word, that does not mean that that dictionary definition is the meaning of the word that everybody knows and will associate with it. So you have to be careful with your connotative language. Sometimes you use connotative language to make a point. Differentiating between a redneck and a hillbilly is a great way to do that in your writing. Other times you're going to have to use the connotative language because it's the only thing you know. But just make sure that when you're looking at things that you're using the word and using it correctly. And there's going to be people who are always going to argue that connotation doesn't matter, it's always denotation, but we all understand and know that language has evolved and that the meanings of words change with language and with the times. So that's just kind of how that works. The fourth thing that you were told to do was use comparisons in your writing. And these are things that most of you are familiar with in some way or another. You were in high school, you took an English class, you probably talked about 1, 2, 3, or all of these at some point, somehow. Comparisons are just ways to use the writing to make a point. So similes, starting at the top, is where you use like or as to compare two things. It's cool as a cucumber. Metaphors are similar to similes. Most people say it compares to things without the use of like or as. That's a basic way of explaining it, but the metaphor is going to be an indirect comparison, describing one thing as if it's another. So that like when you look at this movie and somebody says as a metaphor for life, like something that's happening, this painting you could say is a metaphor for XYZ, whatever you want to say it is, depending on how you look at it. It's a poster, not a painting, but still, this could be a metaphor for something to somebody. Metaphors are looking at things and saying, okay, this is being used, but it's actually like this other thing. Then you've got analogies, and an analogy is a simile that works at two levels. So you're describing these complex relationships through similes. Personification is one that students really like. Personification is where you give human qualities or characteristics to inanimate objects or ideas. So one of my favorite personifications is the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, because she says, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Death is a person in that. He's given a quality of being real, not this thing that happens. Onomatopoeia is one of my favorites just because it's such a weird word. A. And B, it is things that we do sometimes in our daily life that we don't pick up on, but it's also used very heavily in comics or graphic novels if you read those. Onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like the thing that's being described. So crackle, you hear that word and you can kind of hear like crackle. When you say hiss, you hear the s. Shuffle, bang, pow, pop. Those are things that Descriptive words exist for like the thing that's being described. Then you've got alliteration and assonance. These are the two that sometimes people get mixed up or they tend to forget. Alliteration is where you repeat consonant sounds, B, C, D, F, within neighboring words. It doesn't have to be the beginning of the word, it's just in the word itself. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That is alliteration. Assonance, though, is the repeated use of the same vowel sounds. So it's that A, E, I, O, U. You repeat those vowel sounds within neighboring words. So alliteration is consonants, assonance is vowels. You can use those in your writing to make points and to make it a more poignant way of writing. And this even applies in academic writing. Sometimes you may need to use analogies or you may need to use metaphors. Sometimes an onomatopoeia is a great way to get your reader's attention in the middle of writing because it happens and you know that it got your attention, so it'll get your reader's attention. So keep these things in mind. These are very important in not just writing in general, but academic writing can be very much improved upon once you start engaging in using comparisons. And the last one I mentioned was following an organizational method. There are 3 organizational methods that exist. Spatial order is the first one I want to talk about. So when you're describing something with spatial order, you're describing either from like top to bottom, left to right, near to far, far to near, or from a central point and then talking about it outwards. So if I asked you where you're sitting while you're listening or watching this right now to describe the room you're in from that point, you will start off saying, well, in front of me, there is this. To the left of me, behind me. If you describe something from top to bottom, you may like describe Miss Craven and say, yeah, Miss Craven's has got like short red hair. She wears glasses. She, like you'll describe me from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. Left to right just depends on how you view things sometimes. If somebody says, what side of the bookshelf is, like, where is it on the bookshelf? You'll go from left to right and say, there's like 3 blue books and then a green one, and then there's that book. That's left to right. Chronological order is one that you are all familiar with. We already spoke about this in terms of sequence of events. So you will describe things that happen from beginning to end in a period of time. That is how chronological order works. You don't start in the middle and go back and then go forward. You don't start halfway through, a quarter way through, 3/4 of the way through. You always start from the beginning and then move to the end. And then the one that people don't use as often is most to least or least to most, which is where you describe things in order of whether it's most important to least important or least important to most important. That is all going to be up to you in terms of how you're going to describe things. Most of the time when you write, you're going to use chronological. So just keep that in mind. Chronological is just the basis. It's where we go and it's how we do these things. Okay. Now, you may be asking yourself, how am I going to integrate description into the essay? And there are 3 ways to do that. You are only going to include relevant details. I told you this in narration to only tell the relevant parts of the story. Only include relevant details to the story that you're telling or what you're describing. Sometimes you need to know the color of somebody's eyes. Sometimes that's relevant. Other times it's not. Sometimes you need to know what the sky looks like. Other times you don't. So make sure it's just relevant. And that's in all of your writing. Make sure what you're writing about and what you talk about is relevant to what you're going over. You want to keep the description focused. Focus on the thing you're describing. Don't look off to the side and be like, well, wait a minute, let me talk about this thing over here. Talk about the one thing that you're talking about. And then the last way is just make sure the description fits the essay's tone and point of view. That is why keeping things in mind like connotative language, connotations and denotations are essential, because tone in essay writing is very important. And the essay you're going to write is going to be a very reverent tone. So you're not going to use negative language. Okay? No negative language. You do have some homework for this lecture. You have a discussion, and you're also going to describe to me and to your classmates, which is going to be great. Please do keep in mind that if you have questions or concerns, the first point of contact for everything is always going to be your Comp 1 cohort. The second point of contact can be me. Do keep in mind my email policy, though. Keep that in the back of your head, guys. Hopefully you will enjoy writing this essay. Keep this lecture in mind. Just because this lecture ends and we're done with this essay in a couple of weeks does not mean that the skills that you learn end here. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, guys, please. And I will see you later. Have a great day. Bye.